30,000 feet above the Georgia countryside. On an ordinary Tuesday in March 2024, two women who had never met were about to discover that control is the most fragile illusion of all. One carried the weight of unspoken grief beneath a perfect smile and a hidden medal of the Virgin Mary. The other carried the weight of a life built on power, now crumbling beneath her manicured nails. When their worlds collided in the narrow aisle of first class, a chain would snap, a heart would shatter, and heaven itself would step in, wrapped in the scent of roses and the color of a mother's mantle. Before we continue, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Let's see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary have reached. And if you haven't yet joined our family, subscribe now, because here, each day, we witness the tender love and mighty power of the Mother of God. Sarah Bennett had been greeting passengers with the same practiced warmth for 12 years, offering coffee, tea, or a smile she sometimes barely felt. To everyone on board, she was the calm in every storm, the one who could soothe a terrified flyer or silence a rowdy group without raising her voice. But beneath the crisp navy uniform and the silver wings pinned above her heart, Sarah had been hollow since the night her phone rang and a stranger's voice told her that Rachel, 28, radiant, the sister who still believed in answered prayers, was gone. A silent aneurysm. No time for last words. Sarah had flown the next day and every day after, because stopping meant remembering, and remembering meant drowning. The only thing she still allowed herself was Rachel's small oval medal of the Virgin Mary. She wore it on a delicate chain, hidden beneath her collar, close enough to feel its faint weight against her skin when the memories tried to surface. She no longer knew if she believed the promises engraved on the back, "Pray for us," but she couldn't take it off. It was the last piece of Rachel she could still hold. That Tuesday she woke at 5, showered, pressed her uniform until it could cut glass, and met her own eyes in the mirror long enough to force the smile that paid the bills. Another flight, another mask, another day pretending the grief hadn't carved her out from the inside. Diane Crawford didn't pretend. She simply refused to feel. At 48, she moved through airports the way generals move through battlefields, phone in one hand, boarding pass in the other, eyes daring the world to slow her down. 6 months earlier, the divorce had been finalized with the same cold efficiency she brought to quarterly reports. Half the assets, half the house, half a life she had once thought bulletproof. So she worked harder. 90-hour weeks. Red ice that blurred into boardrooms. The Chicago presentation at 2 o'clock represented $20 million and the last thread of the identity she had left. She scrolled through the slides again in the terminal, jaw tight, headache pulsing behind her temples, willing the numbers to stay sharp. She reached security exactly 2 hours early, as always, and felt the familiar surge of irritation at every small delay. The woman fumbling with her liquids bag, the toddler who wandered into her path, the TSA agent who asked her to remove her watch. By the time she boarded the noon flight to Chicago, Diane's patience was a thin wire pulled to breaking. Sarah was working first class. Only 6 passengers, a light load. She moved down the aisle with quiet efficiency, checking seat belts, stowing bags, offering the smile that had become second nature. Diane sat in 2A, window seat, laptop already open, slides glowing. 20 minutes after takeoff, Sarah approached with the drink cart. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Something to drink." Diane didn't look up. "Coffee. Black." The cup appeared. No acknowledgement. 15 minutes later, the call button from 2A lit up. Sarah returned. "Yes, ma'am." Diane gestured at the half-empty cup without raising her eyes. "Cold." "Another." Sarah replaced it with one fresh from the pot. Diane took it wordlessly. Half an hour later, the button again. Sarah felt the professional smile fracture, just for a second. "The air is too strong. I'm freezing." Sarah adjusted the vent. 20 minutes later. "Now it's too hot. Can't anyone here do anything right?" The words were low, precise, laced with the contempt of someone who had long ago decided service workers were invisible. Sarah made the adjustment once more, returned to the galley, and leaned against the counter for one steadying breath. She had no idea the real storm was already seated in 2A. An hour and 20 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign flickered on with a soft chime. Light turbulence rippled through the cabin. Nothing dangerous, just the usual dance of air currents over the Appalachians. Sarah was arranging the snack basket when the plane dipped. She steadied herself against the bulkhead, one hand gripping the cart, the other holding a small tray of water cups. Most stayed in place. One did not. A single plastic cup tipped, rolled down the gentle slope of the aisle, and spilled its contents across the armrest of seat 2A. A few drops splashed onto Diane's open laptop. Diane's reaction was instantaneous. She rose halfway out of her seat, eyes blazing. "Are you kidding me?" The words were not loud, but they carried the lethal quiet of a boardroom dismissal. Sarah hurried forward, napkins already in hand. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. The turbulence caught me off guard. Let me clean that right away." She knelt in the aisle, dabbing at the keyboard, praying no real damage had been done. That was when the metal slipped free. The thin chain had worked its way out from beneath Sarah's collar during the rush of movement. The small silver oval, barely larger than a dime, etched with the gentle profile of the Virgin Mary, swung forward on its delicate links, glinting under the cabin lights. Diane saw it, and something inside her snapped like dry kindling. Perhaps it was the sight of faith on someone she had already decided was beneath her. Perhaps it was the accumulated bitterness of months, years, looking for a target. Whatever it was, it poured out all at once. Diane reached down and seized the chain. One sharp yank, and the links gave way with a tiny metallic cry. The metal flew from Sarah's neck and landed in Diane's palm. For one frozen second, the cabin held its breath. Then Diane hurled the metal to the carpeted floor as if it burned her. Maybe if you spent less time clinging to these childish superstitions and more time doing your job competently, accidents like this wouldn't happen. The words landed harder than any slap. Sarah stared at the tiny silver oval lying on the navy carpet, the last physical thread connecting her to Rachel, and felt 3 years of carefully dammed grief burst all at once. A sound escaped her, half gasp, half sob. She dropped to her knees, not caring that she was in uniform, not caring that 5 other first-class passengers were watching. Her fingers closed around the metal, pressing it to her heart, as if she could somehow press Rachel back into existence. The tears came without permission, deep and wrenching, the kind that shake the whole body. She rocked forward, forehead almost touching the floor, and let herself break completely. The professional smile, the practiced calm, the lie that she was fine, everything shattered. Passengers looked away in awkward sympathy. One man reached for his call button, then thought better of it. The only sound was Sarah's muffled, unstoppable weeping and the soft hum of the engines. Diane stood over her for a moment longer, chest heaving, waiting, almost hoping, for retaliation, for a supervisor to be summoned, for anything that would justify her outrage. Instead, she saw only a woman curled around a piece of silver no larger than a coin, sobbing as though the world had ended. Something cold and sharp slid into Diane's stomach. Shame, perhaps, or the first honest feeling she had allowed herself in years. She turned abruptly and returned to 2A, sat down hard, and stared at the darkened laptop screen. Water droplets still clung to the keyboard like tiny accusations. From the galley curtain, Rebecca, economy-class crew, who had heard the raised voice, appeared. She took one look at Sarah on the floor, another at Diane's rigid back, and understood everything. Kneeling, she slipped an arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Come on, honey. Let's get you to the back." Sarah allowed herself to be lifted, still clutching the metal, tears streaming silently now. Rebecca guided her past the curtain and into the rear galley, drawing it closed behind them like a confessional. In first class, The air felt suddenly heavier. The man across the aisle met Diane's eyes for a second, then looked away in quiet disapproval. Diane opened her laptop, tried to focus on the presentation, but the slides blurred. She told herself the flight attendant was overreacting. It was just a cheap trinket. People were too sensitive these days. But the words rang hollow even inside her own head. She closed the computer with a soft click, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling, trying to ignore the growing knot in her chest. She had no idea that the knot was only the beginning, that something far greater than her anger was already moving through the cabin, gentle as breath, unstoppable as grace. The minutes crawled. Diane kept her eyes fixed on the seatback screen, pretending to watch the moving map while the little airplane icon inched across Tennessee. Inside, shame gnawed like acid. She replayed the scene again and again. The sharp tug of the chain, the tiny metal spinning through the air, the flight attendant folding in on herself like a wounded bird. Diane had meant to humiliate. She had not expected to wound. And the wound, she now realized, had opened in both directions. Then, without warning, the scent arrived that it began as the faintest trace, something sweet, almost shy, brushing the edge of awareness. Diane frowned, assuming someone in business class had opened an overly floral perfume. But the fragrance grew richer, fuller, unmistakably roses in full summer bloom, as though an entire garden had been carried aboard at cruising altitude. She turned her head left, right, no one near. The passenger across the aisle was asleep, the seat behind her empty. Yet the perfume intensified, wrapping around her like warm silk, intimate and undeniable. Diane pressed the call button for water out of sheer reflex, needing something ordinary to ground her. No one came immediately. The crew was still comforting Sarah in the rear. She was alone with the impossible fragrance. It was not coming from the vents, not from a bottle, not from anywhere she could name. It simply was, and it was meant for her. Minutes later, the second phenomenon began that a warmth bloomed directly over her heart, subtle at first, like sunlight through fabric, then deepening into a steady pressure, as though an invisible hand rested there, gentle yet immovable. Diane shifted in her seat. The sensation moved with her. She loosened her silk scarf, unbuttoned the top of her blouse. Nothing helped. The warmth became heat, not painful but insistent, a silent demand for attention. Her pulse hammered against it. For the first time in years, Diane felt small. She stood abruptly and made her way to the forward lavatory, locking the door with shaking fingers. Cold water on her wrists, on her face. She met her own eyes in the mirror and did not recognize the woman staring back. Skin pale beneath the makeup, mouth tight with something that looked suspiciously like fear. The corporate armor, the tailored suit, the perfect highlights, the expression that could freeze a room, suddenly felt like a costume on a child playing dress-up. She saw the exhaustion, the bitterness, the loneliness she had papered over with promotions and frequent flyer miles. The scent of roses followed her into the tiny space, stronger than ever. The warmth over her heart pressed harder, not cruelly, but with the steady insistence of a mother who will not let her child run into traffic. Diane gripped the sink until her knuckles whitened. "Stop," she whispered to no one, to the mirror, to whatever was happening. "Just stop." It did not stop. Instead, as the plane began its initial descent into Chicago, she heard her name, Diane, soft, feminine, impossibly close, like a whisper spoken directly into the shell of her ear. She whipped around. The lavatory was empty. Back in her seat moments later, tray table stowed, seat belt fastened, she heard it again, clearer this time, laced with sorrow and infinite tenderness. Diane. She looked up the aisle and felt every hair on her arms rise that a woman stood there who had not been there seconds before. She wore a mantle of deep, living blue, the color of the sky just after sunset, the color painted on countless statues in little grottos around the world. The fabric fell in soft folds that seemed to catch light that did not exist in the cabin. Her hair was dark and loose, her face radiant with a beauty that hurt to behold, not because it was distant or severe, but because it was pure, unguarded love. Diane had spent years surrounded by powerful people, yet none had ever looked at her the way this woman did now, as if every secret, every wound, every calculated cruelty was already known and, impossibly, already forgiven. Diane tried to speak, to demand who she was, how she had boarded, anything to regain control. No sound came. Her body would not obey. She could only sit, frozen, as the woman in blue took one silent step closer, then another, until she stood directly beside seat 2. The gaze that met Diane's was a mirror and a mercy all at once. In it she saw her entire life on spool. The cutting remarks in meetings, the nights she chose conference calls over her husband's birthday, the way she had weaponized competence into isolation, the moment 6 months ago when she told her mother, "I don't have time for sentiment," and hung up. She saw the divorce papers signed without tears, the empty apartment that echoed like a tomb, and worst of all, today, the cruelty she had just inflicted on a grieving stranger for no reason except that she could. Every defense crumbled. Tears rose unbidden, burning tracks down cheeks that had forgotten how to cry. Yet beneath the devastation ran a current of something warmer, an offer, a promise, a love that asked nothing and withheld nothing. The woman in blue said no words aloud, but Diane heard them anyway, deep in the place where shame and hope collide. "You are not beyond repair. You are not alone. Come home." The smile that followed was small, almost heartbreaking in its gentleness. The smile of a mother who has waited on the porch through every storm for her child to finally walk back up the path. Then, as soundlessly as she had appeared, the woman turned and was simply gone. The aisle was empty. The scent of roses lingered for another heartbeat before fading into ordinary cabin air. Diane sat stunned, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, the warmth over her heart easing into something that felt suspiciously like peace. Outside the window, Chicago's skyline glittered in the afternoon sun, indifferent and magnificent. The plane banked gently, beginning its final approach. For the first time in more years than she could count, Diane Crawford did not care about being late. The woman in blue stood motionless for a moment that stretched into eternity, her presence filling the cabin like light through stained glass. Diane's breath caught in her throat as the gaze deepened, pulling her into a silent reckoning. Every layer of her carefully constructed life peeled away under those eyes, eyes that held the sorrow of a mother who had watched her child stray far from home. Diane saw it all. The boardroom where she had belittled a young intern until he quit, the anniversary dinner she canceled for a client call, the way she had dismissed her husband's quiet pleas for more time until he finally walked away with nothing but regret. She saw the phone calls to her mother ignored, the friendships withered from neglect, the nights she lay awake convincing herself that power was enough, that vulnerability was for the weak. The images came not as accusations, but as truths laid bare, each one laced with the pain she had inflicted and the deeper pain she had buried within herself. Tears streamed down Diane's face unchecked, her body still frozen in the seat, unable to look away. Yet woven through the sorrow was something Diane had never expected, a profound, unearned tenderness. It was as if the woman knew every dark corner of her soul and chose to love her anyway, extending a forgiveness that asked nothing in return. No words were spoken, but Diane felt them resonate in her core. "You have wandered, my child, but the way back is open. I have been waiting. Let go." The warmth over her heart pulsed now like a living thing, not oppressive but inviting, urging her to release the armor she had worn for so long. Diane's mind raced through excuses. "I had to be strong. No one else would fight for me. This is how the world works." But they dissolved like mist under the gaze. For the first time, she understood that her control had been no control at all, just a cage she had built around her own heart, locking out love, locking out grace. The woman smiled then, a small, radiant curve of her lips that carried the weight of centuries of quiet intercession. It was the smile of Lourdes, of Fatima, of Guadalupe, the blessed mother appearing not to the perfect but to the broken, offering hope where none seemed possible. In that smile, Diane glimpsed who she could become. Not the vice president clawing for scraps of power, but a woman capable of compassion, of connection, of the quiet strength that comes from surrender. The vision held for one more breath, then faded as gently as it had come. The aisle was empty again, the cabin ordinary, the engines humming their steady descent. Diane slumped back, exhausted and alive in a way she hadn't felt since childhood. The scent of roses dissipated like incense after Mass, leaving only a faint sweetness in the air. Outside, O'Hare's runways came into view, the city sprawling beneath them like a promise. The plane touched down smoothly, wheels kissing asphalt with barely a jolt. Passengers stirred, gathering coats and bags, murmuring about connections and traffic. Diane did not move. The $20 million meeting was already 15 minutes underway without her. The client would be furious, her boss apoplectic. For the first time in her career, she didn't care. When first class emptied, she rose on unsteady legs and walked not toward the jet bridge but aft, past the curtain into the narrow galley where Sarah sat on a jump seat, metal clutched in her lap, eyes still rimmed red. Rebecca stood protectively nearby, arms crossed. Diane stopped at a respectful distance, hands open in surrender. "I came to apologize," she said, voice raw and stripped of its executive polish. Sarah looked up, wary but listening. Rebecca shifted, ready to intervene. Diane pressed on, tears welling again. "For ripping that from you, for my words, for treating you like you didn't matter. There's no excuse. I was cruel because I've been cruel to myself for so long. I'm sorry. Truly." The galley fell silent save for the distant whine of baggage carts outside. Sarah studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I accept," she said quietly, exhaustion giving way to something softer. "Thank you for saying it." Diane wanted to explain. The vision, the roses, the way everything had shattered and reformed in midair, but the words felt too sacred, too fresh. She only nodded back, whispered another, "I'm sorry," and turned to leave, stepping off the plane into a world that suddenly felt wide open. The Chicago air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of the city. Diane bypassed baggage claim and hailed a taxi straight to her hotel, giving the address without small talk. In the back seat, she stared at her phone, the screen a blur of missed calls and urgent emails. None of it mattered. Not anymore. In the hotel room overlooking the magnificent Mile, Diane sat on the edge of the bed fully dressed, shoes still on, staring at her phone as though it belonged to a stranger. It was 2:15 p.m. The meeting had started without her. $20 million, her reputation, perhaps her entire career, gone in the space of one flight. And yet the loss felt distant, almost weightless, like something that had happened to another woman in another lifetime. She scrolled to a contact she had not opened in over 2 years. "Mom." Her thumb hovered. The last conversation had ended in shouting, Diane accusing her mother of living in the past, of clinging to rosaries and old photographs while the world moved on. "I don't have time for sentiment," she had snapped, and hung up. Now those words echoed back like a curse. She pressed call.it rang 3 times. "Hello." The voice was older, cautious, laced with the faint hope that always broke Diane's heart, even when she pretended it didn't. "Hi, Mom. It's me." Silence. Then a soft intake of breath. "Diane, I'm sorry," she blurted before courage could fail her. "For everything. For disappearing. For the things I said. For choosing everything else over you, over family." Her voice cracked. The tears came again, not the controlled trickle of the plane but a flood, years in the making. I've been awful. I've been so lost, Mom. I thought if I just worked harder, controlled everything, it would be enough. But today something happened. She told her everything, haltingly at first, then in a rush. The cruelty on the plane, the scent of roses that had no source, the warmth over her heart. The woman in blue who appeared from nowhere and looked at her with eyes full of sorrow and limitless love. It was her, Mom, the Virgin Mary. I know how insane that sounds, but it was her. She didn't say a word, but I heard her anyway. She saw all of me, the worst of me, and she still wanted me back. On the other end of the line, her mother was crying too, the soft, cleansing tears of answered prayer. "Oh, my baby," she whispered. "I never stopped praying for you. Every single night, on my knees, with the same rosary you used to laugh at." She heard me. She always hears a mother's prayer. They talked for nearly 2 hours about the divorce Diane had never really grieved, about the loneliness that had become her normal, about the flight attendant whose name Diane didn't even know yet, whose pain had become the crack through which grace poured in. When they finally hung up, Diane felt lighter than she had in decades, as though the plane had not landed in Chicago, but in a new country altogether. 6 months later, Sarah received a letter forwarded from the airline. Inside was a small box and a handwritten note on heavy cream stationery. "Sarah, I never properly introduced myself that day. My name is Diane Crawford. I was the woman in 2A who hurt you so deeply. There is no apology large enough, but please know I live with what I did every day, and I am trying, imperfectly, to become someone who would never do it again. Enclosed is a replacement for what I broke. I had it made by the same artisan in Italy who crafted the one my own mother wears. I hope someday you can wear it without remembering my cruelty, only the love your sister had for Our Lady, and the love Our Lady still has for you. Because of you, I found my way back to faith, to family, to myself. You were the instrument God used to save me, even as I was breaking you. I will never stop being grateful." With humility and endless gratitude, Diane inside the box lay a delicate silver chain and an oval medal, identical in size and design to the one Rachel had worn, but new, gleaming, untouched by loss. On the back, instead of the usual inscription, were engraved 4 simple words: "Love never fails." Sarah held it up to the light, tears falling once more, but this time they tasted like healing. She slipped it around her neck, right next to her heart, where Rachel's presence still lived, and where, she now understood, the Virgin Mary had never stopped watching over them both. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not prevent the storm. They arrive in the middle of it, wearing a blue mantle, carrying the scent of roses, and using the most unexpected hands to snap the chains we forged ourselves. If this story has touched you, do 3 small things for Our Lady today. 1. Write in the comments: "Blue mantle, the color that changed 2 lives forever." 2. Share this video with someone who feels too far gone for mercy. 3. Pray 1 Hail Mary for every soul flying through turbulence right now, visible or invisible. May the Blessed Virgin Mary, our gentle mother, wrap you in her blue mantle and lead you safely home. Amen.